Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting our presentation really soon.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jenny Rodenhouse. I'm assistant professor at Art Center College of Design, and I'm also the director of the Immersion Lab.
Hello, my name is Santiago Lombeira. I'm a research scientist with the California Institute of Technology as part of the Center for Data-Driven Discovery. And I'm also part of the faculty at Interaction Design program as part of the Art Center College of Design.
Designing for multiplayer publics presents the outcome of an Art Center design studio hosted within Caltech's Second Life campus called Virtech. As co-faculty, Santiago and I taught a multidisciplinary studio this fall, and so we will share how the course, one, used a multiplayer platform to research and build new digital specific learning spaces, and two, revealed an emergent creative pedagogy and practice for designing for the virtual public. An Art Center College of Design, for those who don't know about it, is a art and design school located in Pasadena, California, and it hosts majors from product design to fine art to transportation design and to illustration. And the studio that we're speaking about today, and we're both faculty within this department, is a studio that was hosted by the Interaction Design Department, and it was purposely transdisciplinary so that we could host and bring in different designers and artists across Art Center to work within this brief. In Interaction Design at Art Center, the department itself really examines the way in which humans interact with the computer, crafting our perceptions with and as designers and artists, we typically begin our work by conducting research through people and software, designing outcomes through iteration and critique. And this is really central to our process, our creative process. And we really utilize the studio to construct, share, and collaborate around our work. But as we are now spending more time in front of our screens, how does these design process change? We no longer have the studio space sort of around us that is the unifier. And we really have this sense of community has disappeared. So where did it go and how can we access it? And something that we're really interested in is that we are observing populations within online multiplayer platforms had increased significantly, obviously within the last year, expanding to populations that are larger than some countries and are accessible by most computers or phones. So while they might just seem fun or strange, we believe that they're places for serious research and design. Each multiplayer site has its own cultural history, its own economy, and sense of governance, making a Second Life, an Animal Crossing, or a Fortnite, for example, a really exciting space for artists and designers to test, publish, sell, or even engage a global community of us as avatars in work. So how are we exploring multiplayer platforms not just as forms of play, but as public sites for design research, authorship, and collaboration? And how can these spaces specifically help us reimagine the learning environment, such as the college campus? And we also are wondering about how can we leverage the imaginative affordances of virtual space to really create new ways of designing for also new people to design for as well. And as we step back, it's not just about replicating a college campus, because yes, college campuses, they're arrangements of land and building, but they really represent so much more. Really, they're presenting a way of thinking. And colleges have this long history of being the sites of experimentation. But something that we didn't want to replicate as we move forward in this studio was re-prototyping this sort of city on a hill where campuses traditionally have sort of been removed from public view, rendering these kind of creative processes or approaches kind of this grand mystery. So we were really interested in, as we move online, like Zoom can have that sense of kind of being another city on a hill, sort of separated from view. But really, with the multiplayer spaces, we got really excited about this idea of extending our learning community beyond the campus, or the traditions of a campus, and the traditions of a studio. So how could we do that? And so how can digital software such as multiplayer platforms and interactions and accessible social spaces really challenge this existing campus model in collegiate history, and help us really reimagine new spaces for higher education right now? Multi-public spaces offer design and opportunity to really iterate within the view of visitors, and I think that was something we were really excited about, is having students expose their process and their project to live feedback and interaction within the space of Second Life, creating kind of a co-authored college campus for both Art Center and Caltech students who are really challenged with working across multiple time zones, spaces, and disciplines. And of course, as we move forward, we are also really interested in saying, well, looking at the existing way of socializing or interacting within a college campus, where maybe they meet in a studio and then they sort of follow up on these other communication channels, but how might we collapse that or make it more seamless now, especially as that shared context is very missing? So how can, again, we sort of collapse this current interaction flow, moving from just Zoom class into a different platform to follow up, but maybe look at Second Life as a way in which we could kind of bring those forms of communication together.
Cool. So let me talk a little bit about how Art Center and Caltech connected and how we decided to generate this class. Next. So what is Caltech? First of all, so Caltech is an engineering school. It's usually among the top 10 engineering schools in the country. It's been #1 several times. We have a 3-to-1 faculty-student ratio. We only have 900 undergrads and 1,300 graduate students. We have the pleasure of that we've produced 40 Nobel Prize winners, laureates, and there's actually 7 Nobel laureates currently in residence. And just to show off a little bit, I've gotten a chance to work with 2 of them, so that's really exciting. Next. So the Caltech campus is fairly small. It's pretty. It's right in close to the heart of Pasadena, California. The next, the architecture of the school itself is kind of this California Spanish colonial revival architecture. But it has some pretty magnificent buildings, has some interesting fountains, but it has a couple of brand new, gorgeous, eco-friendly buildings. So the campus itself is fairly pretty. It's fun. It's nice to walk around. It's very calm and relaxed. But really, Caltech campus is more than that, right? Campus is a lot more than just its buildings. Next. So in fact, with all the research that we have, we actually manage JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So these are the people that we were able to land the Perseverance rover 4 weeks ago on the surface of Mars. We have an amazing robotics team. We have an amazing chemistry program, material sciences, biologists, We have a really strong program in nanotechnology, nanofabrication, just to name a few. So the research that's being conducted at Caltech is very impressive. And the one thing that we're good at is with a small amount of people being able to shine. So we're very focused on the work that we do. We don't have every kind of studies at Caltech, but the ones we do very fairly well. Next. But of course, it's ultimately about the people. Caltech students, again, it's just, again, for understanding the context of the kind of people that come to Caltech, they usually end up being very, very smart students. We have really cool, fun traditions like this thing called Ditch Day, where people get to just kind of challenge each other through different, what's called stacks that they need to solve. So you see like a whole kind of Death Star, Death Ray thing that they had to do once in the lawn. So there's all sorts of cool things. But then for the most part, next, when I think of Caltech, you think of a fairly sparse campus. This is kind of the rush hour in between classes, just some few students in shorts kind of walking around. So how we actually are able to bring these things together, that's very important. Next. So we need to be, we had to find a way to actually be able to get the students to connect with each other, especially under the current circumstances where we're especially first year students, we're not able to meet in person. Caltech heavily relies on the housing system, which is equivalent to a fraternity system. Basically think of Hogwarts, and Hufflepuff versus Gryffindor. And in fact, that theme seems to come up quite a bit in Ditch Day. And this is a great way for people to kind of start meeting the different kinds of people that are in campus, find peers that have things in common. And this is really the strongest way for people to meet each other and forge relationships. And of course, during COVID times, we could not do that. So we had to find a way to actually bring all these people together, a way to have the students be able to find each other somewhere that it's stress-free, and of course, a sense of presence and immersion that it's scattered throughout every single presentation that we've heard in the last couple of days. Next. So out of that came Vertech. It all came out of George. He's right here in the audience. Curious George. Professor George Yurgovsky. He's a pioneer in virtual worlds applied to science and education. He's conducted tons of symposiums and classes in astrophysics. He's done stuff with NASA here in Second Life. And it was fairly clear that Second Life was a really strong candidate to have the ability to bring the students together, to have them talk to each other, to have a free space to actually talk to each other and really kind of move among peer groups in a virtual space. So we created Virtech, which is a plot of land. It's a small island. It's private. Because we're bringing in students, we need to be FERPA compliant. So we have to make sure that we have all the protection for anonymity, and make sure also they're not exposed to adult material. So the control of levels of maturity that Second Life offers is very strong. And out of that, next came, this wonderful, gorgeous space. It has waterfalls. It's a great space for students to hang out and relax. But we also have other spaces next. Have coffee shops and just places to meet. We have classrooms. We have areas where students can actually meet with each other. But that's just basically the first floor or Vertex. Once we get into the higher floors of Vertex, we have spaces that are purely designed for creativity, for exploration. Obviously, the first thing that we did myself was, can we reproduce a little bit of what we're familiar in Caltech? We have our DNA fountain, we have the equivalent of our student center, our big auditorium. So we started kind of creating these spaces, but pretty soon we realized, okay, there's so much more we can do with this space. Next. So that's where the connection with Art Center came about. Art Center, like Jenny introduced, is a college of design and art, and it also happens to be located in Pasadena itself. It has these two gorgeous buildings, campuses really close to us, and it's also usually one of the top 5 universities in art and design in the country. So our idea is like, let's reach out to Art Center and let's figure out how can we push what we can actually do in this kind of space. How can we break out of the box and really have students engage socially, academically, and just be able to think of new design paradigms? How do we expand what we can do and we can generate in this space? Obviously, we next we had started doing our background research, and we interviewed students, and we thought of the basic activities that we could do in the basic spaces, everything from coffee shops to campfire to puzzles to escape rooms. Those were all interesting, cool things we could do. But we knew that when we exposed this stuff next, what we thought would be just simple translation of the spaces, we knew that for sure Art Center people could do much better, that the procedure that we do for all our classes at Art Center to help them expand and think outside the box to create new things would work beautifully. And that's really what happened. Next. So this is actually the 3rd floor of Vertech, which we opened up for Art Center students to create. And it's just this wonderful, almost theme park of different experiences and tools, all very carefully crafted to engage students in different fashions. And we'll talk about each individual's region in the coming in the next sections. But it was all just be able to create next all these different things from basic transportation spaces to ways of explore things that Art Center and Caltech have in common, and just ways to understand this space that we created a class to actually be able to get all these output of our students.
So for this undergraduate studio, Santiago and I created a studio, Pedagogy, that really focused on more introductory research assignments that were completed within the first 4 weeks of the studio. And these challenges really gave the students the opportunity to, one, learn through Second Life community, and really engage with exploring the space itself. That's so much a part of what the studio was about. And then also learn the medium of digital world building. So many of them, yes, maybe a few know 3D modeling, a few are really experts at interaction design, but what is it to build within this particular space that learning to the kind of how to sketch, experiment, and explore, leveraging these freedoms of Second Life world and its virtual affordances, as well as develop new digital learning opportunities and representations based on those research insights. So a typical Art Center class really runs 14 weeks, so that was kind of our given framework. And so it was really a choice of ours to dedicate this first month of just research and sort of ramping up students and immersing them within this space through weekly prototyping and feedback. And of course, as they proceed through the 14 weeks, they're given feedback from those visiting Virtech, from faculty like ourselves and other peers. So that would, user testing processes were conducted within Virtech, allowing each team or individual team to really refine their proposition over that given period of the fall term. So now what we want to do is transition into sharing a lot of the outcomes of the studio, highlighting our studio pedagogy, specifically these introductory challenges that we feel really help shape the student work and their final outcomes and how they propose new learning spaces and student interactions. So the first one, we were really interested in this question of how can you simply use form to communicate a specific message, rather than you relying on, call to actions or text. How can, especially as artists and designers, we think so much about managing perceptions through the forms that we make. That's really our expertise. So how can we sort of throw students immediately into that and get them just to sort of start to craft form and really help shape communication through collage or colliding. So we gave them this challenge around how do you bring two different communities together, or two different communities of information together through form. So the first project we'll share is from a fine arts student, Sergio Garcia. He utilized the found forms of a fountain and a military tank to draw Virtech visitors towards learning about Caltech's military research. Why we really love this project is that because historically fountains formed the center of a town, so they already kind of had that well understood function of providing a place or a site where inevitably stories and news were sort of shared. So he was really leveraging that history of this architecture typology. And so once you bring in a fountain, though, in Second Life, right, it's no longer a fountain. It's no longer providing this necessary infrastructure of giving water. You don't drink from it, but rather Sergio really leveraged the form again as like this form that we see a lot in college campuses or around college campuses, and understood it as more of this site or symbol of social congregation. And what we really loved from our discussions through this project that he developed is that it's not about copying the real directly, but rather thinking about, as you bring in these forms from reality, think about what is the new purpose and how you can switch it and reserve the digital community, but in a new way. So there's just another view of the fountain that he proposed.
So the next project we want to talk about was work done by Kosai Kanashi. And so one of the areas that we have in common also between Art Center and Caltech, which there's many of them, is one of them is material sciences. So at Caltech, we have this large group that studies material sciences, how to create better materials, make them lighter, make them stronger. While at Art Center, there's a strong design team that in between industrial design and we have our sewing lab, where it's all about how to use materials to create better products, how to engage, especially novel technologies, wearables, the whole thing. So the idea of material science is very much something that we have in common. So among all that work, Kosai really focused on the work from Julia Greer. So Julia Greer does mostly nanofabrication. So this is constructing objects, building elements at the nanoscale. So we're talking 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So what's really cool about nanofabrication is that you can construct elements based on these basic structures, on this basic almost scaffolding, these lattices. And you can control, you can make things that are extremely strong, but also lightweight. And notice that people like JPL, whenever they're creating their instruments or they're creating the spacecraft that they're working on, they have a database of these lattices, of these basic structures, and they know how to go around and try to figure out which element is best for them to construct their objects. Because while some of them are better at transmitting temperature, some of them are better at isolating. Some are very rigid in specific directions, but in the other directions they have quite a bit of shear. And it depends exactly what is it that you're trying to accomplish. Next. So what Kosai decided to do is decided to create basically a museum, an experience where you go through it, and as you go through it, you start understanding a little more about nanofabrication and nanotechnology. The first thing that you're exposed is with a scale system, so you get to see something at nanoscale, so basically you can't see it. Then eventually when you multiply it times 100,000, then it becomes something that actually starts to become invisible. Once you make it times 1,000,000, it becomes big. Once you make it 10 million, then it's actually fairly large. So it starts kind of give you kind of a sense of scale. Next. And we were able to use these lattices throughout the whole museum. So even the walls are actually exposed are made out of these materials. Next. But once you actually get in the heart of it, you actually start experiencing different ways of looking at these lattices, at these nanostructures. Um, and COSI did a lot of effort to say, how do we push forward the idea that this element is really light? So why don't we just put it on top of the dandelion? If it sits on a dandelion, it must be pretty light. How about the fact that we can control the shear? But what if somebody holding it and balancing it quite easily? It might mean that symmetry has perfect symmetry and flexibility to be able to actually allow for somebody to holding it like that. And then how do we signify that something is extremely can handle quite a bit of stress? How about we put a gigantic rock on top of it? So COSI was able to create all these different representations next to actually kind of explore what it means to show all these physical attributes of this nanotechnology through visuals. And we get to really kind of break the whole paradigm of scale and just kind of blow it up and kind of mix it up with other things. And we thought it was kind of an excellent example of really having the process of the class kind of push and inspire to create something that really connects with the audience.
The next challenge we gave students was to think about how can you use the type, like an event, another event type to bring people together. Whereas the first challenge we were really looking at how can you leverage form to draw attention or draw or collect people. Now how can you use the sort of mechanic of an event. So we gave them a challenge to construct a space of learning, use found event, some sort of found event typology that could be a party, for example, and that would be a way to construct an experiential learning landscape through. And we also added they had to do it through co-authorship, some sort of co-authorship session where they were all working together to construct the space. So product and interaction design students Eddie, Gao, and Quincy and Jiwan, they utilize Art Center's machine shop tutorial and certification process to create Machinarium. So they were really reflecting on their experience around having no longer access to campus resources, such as physical equipment and shops to create their work, and that as they understood it through their research, that Caltech students were also missing that access. And typically, a lot of our students go through this rigorous training process and certification, these certification workshops. So students were really starting to feel like, oh no, am I forgetting these concepts? You know, these tools are really intimidating, and they become less imitating the further I use them. So they're like, I'm sort of not using, I'm going a year without using it. Am I going to be too fearful when I go back into the shop? So they were sort of imagining this space as something that they could utilize within the interim, or kind of help reinforce or help them reimagine how they would be when they get back into these workshop environments. So the space I proposed was really about how to make these workflows and the tools maybe less intimidating once they return to campus. And utilizing the freedom of scale and collage co-authorship. I think the form really communicates that quite clearly. The students started to construct a space from the equipment, both from Caltech and Art Center, often common equipment that they sort of imagined both campuses have, and students would benefit from sort of being around or seeing again. And something that we really love is that how these strong, huge forms immediately communicate the function of the space. That even from afar, you're like, okay, I generally understand the subject matter on approach. And that's something we also talked about is within Second Life, how are you communicating both from afar, close up, or in flight? And they're also quite playful with their approach too, encouraging both exploration from ground and air. So I think that's something else that's really successful with their project outcome. And then each saw, each model, as you start to explore around, you'll see here like the bandsaw, each of them are labeled, and they also have guided tutorials organized around these large pieces of equipment. And they really imagined and created a space that people could really get lost in the details and sort of fly up, learn about how to use the drill press, and then come back to the bandsaw and go through a workshop to refamiliarize themselves with that particular machine. Something else they uncovered was they started to integrate iconic architecture through this kind of act of collaging these forms. And the architecture were both like iconic forms from Art Center and the Caltech campus. And what was smart about it was that, again, they're kind of reinforcing this thing of this nostalgia, or like pining for the campus where they used to be. But something that was smart about it is that as soon as you entered Virtech, it really helped students feel welcome, that the space was sort of speaking directly to them. So for example, this is the bridge within Virtech that they utilize, and then the bridge from Art Center, and that's what they were replicating. So it's this really nice sense of modeling nostalgia for the place that they wanted to remember. Yeah, and they also had this other welcome area at the bottom of one of the drill press. So if you enter the space here, it would allow you to also view the equipment to avatar scale. So they did such a great job of really thinking through scale as a communication tool, so that you could stand next to the drill press or the bandsaw, but then also equally explore at the larger kind of monumental scale. And they also imagined how this space, again, their inspiration was a particular event, that they then kind of reimagined how that event could be brought back into this virtual space, so that they were like, okay, could workshop teachers or technicians host virtual workshops and certification processes here, and really bring together, again, groups of students. And that's where oftentimes you meet a lot of friends, is sort of going to these workshop spaces. So they really went kind of end to end in thinking about the user's experience within this space.
For sure, the work that our students were doing was impressive, and those giant drills were just gorgeous to fly around. But from a different perspective, interaction design student Jiaming Mao kind of took upon, well, so what does it mean for us to kind of bring some other activities that we're already doing in real life and bring them into this virtual world? More specifically, hackathons. The hackathons that happen at Caltech are a place where people can really learn and get challenged by new concepts, and be able to kind of work with your peers and do things within just 24 hours, 48 hours. And that's really, really amazing. And exactly the same thing actually happens at Art Center as well. So both campuses actually host hackathons on a regular basis. So how can that be translated to a space like Second Life? So the goal was then to just how do we approach this to make it as interesting as possible, and still talk the language that we speak through Second Life and as part of Art Center and Caltech. So one of the other areas that we have in common is transportation. There's the transportation design department at Art Center is like the top school in the country, if not the world, for car design that's around. And then the work that's been doing in self-driving cars and automaton at Caltech is just amazing. So that's something that also Caltech and Art Center have in common. So Jiaming decided, how about we bring this together and actually try to create some kind of hackathon within the Second Life space. Next. So he created basically what is a racetrack. It looks like a racetrack, but the idea was, this is the space where we'll actually let people kind of explore what it means to kind of create objects that can actually be driving around. And we can create competitions with who can do the fastest, who can do the smoothest, the one that navigates most obstacles, whatever it is. Next. And of course, most of the time people, when they think about driving around, you think cars and motorcycles, but you can also bring a boat on a road in Second Life. That's not a big deal. Next. But the way we get started is just with a simple block of wood. The most basic prim you can res is just a block that automatically gets given the wood texture, and we can just add a script to it. So he created this space where you go in there, you just see the objects, and you immediately start driving them. You can copy it, and you can edit in the script. And now we have an environment where people can actually really go in there and be very playful and try different things and create this environment. And again, he had to design this whole space. So it wasn't just the racetrack. It was how you actually got here, how you actually learn about the different steps to create something and to edit these things. There was a sign-up board with some times posted saying, every Friday, 7 o'clock, we have a brand new race, show up with your team. So it was creating this whole complete space, really engaging what it means to create one of these hackathons within the space of Second Life. And it was, super fun. And you see people spending hours just kind of playing around with little blocks.
And finally, our last challenge, we were really wanting students to think about how do you pass on information through spatial exploration. And that came out of a long discussion we had around like, how do you really learn? And that learning extends so much beyond the classroom or the studio space. It's the act of traveling or moving through your environment and your given context. So we were really interested in leveraging that insight, and especially in Second Life, when it is so much around the kind of exploration of this world, how could they design a specific tour or utilize, again, that form of a tour to communicate a sequence of information. Another project that fine art student Sergio did was he utilized the highway form to construct a navigation system within Virtech. And here's an example of what it looks like. So it ended up serving as a guide around various sites within this virtual campus. So some of the examples that we've already shown you, the highway essentially was connecting various off-ramps or giving you kind of overviews of the entire space. So it served as this way to sort of playfully introduce students to where to go, because I think that's what he was sort of remarking on, was like, I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go or what I should do. Especially kind of like entering the space immediately. So he was really interested in easing that experience for new users. And here's another point of view and some early studies and models that he developed, thinking about ways in which you could snake up or get off an on-ramp and what that would look like. Something else that we really loved that he did was construct these billboards, and he started to really imagine that this would be a way in which you could host Caltech or Arts Center student projects and research. So it became kind of highway as exhibition space, because again, why not? Because you can leverage those capabilities within Second Life. And here's some other examples of like signage that he created to kind of help guide people through. And then close-ups of other kind of work that he had his friends make and that he then utilized within this billboard system. So the highway could also kind of be inevitably like hosting other events like other races or curated exhibitions. So it had this life beyond just itself. And then, so Sergio's project, we really love it because it combines this insight of just, he had so much fun navigating Second Life and driving virtual cars. And we had this amazing discussion in class one day around students sort of missing that routine of driving to Art Center, driving home, especially because in highway system in Los Angeles in particular, that's so much of this iconic experience of how we experience a place. We really so much tie it to that form of a highway. So we thought there was also this really lovely transition. But again, the highway can now become something so much more and sort of playful and really help celebrate these two collegiate cultures around it.
So the last project we want to highlight is the work of students Ziyiju, Wang Zhengqi, and Tim Kim, and it's called The Forest of Doors. Basically, again, going same idea that as Serge did in the last project, they were trying to figure out, okay, how do we get people to connect between the two campuses? Art Center and Caltech, yes, they're both in Pasadena, but they're a couple of miles away from each other. Some of the students know each other, some don't. So how do we create this connectivity? So the idea was, okay, maybe we need to create bridges. Bridges was, had a visual language that was very familiar to art center students with art building that looks like a big bridge. So, but how what else can we do? And quickly, this idea kind of started evolving into how about just we create a space for people they can just uh, they can experience different parts of Vertech and Second Life through this semi kind of randomized way of just traveling through tunnels, through portals. So immediately started to figure, okay, let's think of something recognizable as a symbol of going from one space to another space. And that was a door. So they latched onto the idea of a door as a portal that would send them into the semi-randomized spaces just by traveling from one spot to another. Next. Their concepts came from this original view on the right that you see, kind of this gorgeous tunnel. It was very beautiful, but it became about the experience of the tunnel rather than the endpoints. So rather they translated to this other space, which is like a forest of doors that you see at the bottom of this tree, that would then send them to these atriums, and these atriums would be places where they could actually explore these things. And ultimately, the idea was, let's send visitors into spaces that they find interesting and different. The idea of Instagrammable spaces. So any place that you would go to say, wow, this is an awesome place for me to take a selfie. That was very strong. And basically, as you strung those things along, you basically create almost like a visual blog of a Second Life experience, of a travel log. Next. This is kind of kind of a higher view of this land of portal of doors. All the doors look the same, but each door always takes you to the same spot. Yes, like Looney Tunes. And as you travel from one door, you end up in this atriums. And the thing about these atriums is that they're closed spaces. So you go in there, and while you see an interesting, really cool space in front of it, you are safe. You are in this nice little enclosure that's glass, but you can sit down, you can relax, you can see people doing whatever they're doing, whether they're working with drill presses or driving cars. And it's up to you to decide when you want to just cross the invisible glass and actually the ghost glass and actually go into the audience, or you can just take the door that's right behind you. Next. And you can always go back to the spot where you came from. Next. So this is a distance view of the third level of Vertech, of all the stuff in that art center Arson's built. At the top, you see the Nanya Museum. You see the Sergis Highway with all the cool views and different spots where they have scenic art being shown. You see the Hackathon racetrack at the bottom, and you see the Machinarium at the right. And then peppered throughout this whole space are these glass atriums, and they all serve as an endpoint of each of the doors that we see at the bottom left. Next. At some point, there was at least 24 of these atriums, and again, because we can pop them wherever we want to, at some point I'm sure there were more before we run out of space. But it basically created this really fun way of interacting for the audience, going in there and learning new ways of finding new adventures and new cool ways of seeing the thing, all within kind of a certain safety and a certain protocol that felt very familiar and very understandable. And really seeing the students, the three students, go from the original views of how do we connect campuses to this kind of experience of opening up the world through this semi-randomized paradigm. That's that ability for them to break out of their very straight thoughts into these more open spaces. That was really fun. That was a great growth to see and to witness out of our students.
So in conclusion, we asked students to imagine a virtual campus while also being in one. So their work really constructed that campus over the 14 weeks. And we use Second Life to challenge this collection of artists and designers to rethink what it means to learn within this context, while leveraging the affordances of multiplayer platforms to both research, creating that creative framework for themselves, and to then formally create. So through the design of the studio, we also really leverage those same learning outcomes that we feel like we translated to the students as well, really crafting our own research pedagogy in interactive design processes that expose the students to a multiplayer workflow. What is it to have more multiplayer interactions and include those and be open to including those within your work, as well as learning how to do 3D formal communication. So through this studio, we propose as well is to sort of conclude is that we're really excited about thinking about multiplayer platforms as this emergent space for not only design education, but also an exciting space for designers to test, publish, sell, and engage a global community of us as avatars in their work. Thank you so much.
So we wanted to conclude by thanking, of course, all the work done by our students that were featured here. And I'll also point you to a site that has some of those pictures. If you want to follow up on your own, I'll put it on the chat. And of course, we want to thank George, who was the catalyst to make all this happen and kind of the inspiration behind Virtech and this class. I want to thank Maggie Henry, who's the Director of Interaction Design at Art Center, and Jim Barry, who's a faculty and the whole art department at Caltech, who actually graced us with an awesome tour of the actual Caltech campus via Zoom cameras. Thank you so much. And we're open to questions. So I'll go back to the chat and see if I can find any questions while we were presenting.
I think there was one I was interested in was a question we just had was, I work with a new tech group at my high school. What suggestions do you have for digital project creation at the high school level? And something I submitted into the chat was definitely considering some of the other classes we teach is AR or VR, and we get a lot of students who don't necessarily know 3D modeling, and I think that's tends to be this like very intimidating sort of entry point. And so I think like really helping students understand how to be creative with like primitives or found 3D models or even just basic imagery, just to see it, to get them into that creation workflow is something that I would suggest.
So there's a question, has our work been published as part of a particular journal, or is it too new yet? We just finished our class. I want to say, it's exactly 9 weeks ago that we finished our class. And we saw the opportunity to present it here as our first step into figuring out how to get our ideas out in the universe. There's also a news story from Art Center itself focusing on our work. But otherwise, we have not, I don't think we've actually focused on any journal publication, but if anybody has any places that think would appreciate our work, would be open to suggestions. Thank you. Yes, Bethany, I think the atriums were, I think originally they were closed off rooms, and the moment they put glass, so it became that the space where you can see and you can admire. And I think, for Caltech students especially, who can be a little shy, to know that you can go into this space and you can take your time before you decide to join the hackathon. You can just stare at it from this little space before you decide to cross over and actually walk into it. And if you want, you can just kind of retreat. And yes, people can see you anyway because it's all glass, but it's it's Second Life. So I think there lots of the boundaries are very kind of still there, but it kind of makes it really flexible and fluid. So yes, the atriums were really nice.
Another question in the chat, were the students for the most part self-directed? Did they stay focused on their own? Did you have to encourage them? So we have our studio it's 5 hours long on a weekly basis, once a week. So the introductory assignments that we went through, that was this very curated sort of point of view of these tasks. So that was the hopes of them kind of discovering their own insights from their own point of view. So we left things very open-ended in the hopes that they're all kind of coming to the studio with different backgrounds and different expertise. But once they kind of proposed after that 1-month research phase, they proposed their own projects, and from there we go into a cadence of like weekly critique. So that's where Santiago and I would meet with them, talk about where they're at with their project, what refinements could be made. We would equally pair them up with various peers and do some user testing around going, is your form communicating the function? Is it being used how you want it to? If not, how do you improve upon that? Let's talk about different options. So, I mean, of course, it's very guided from the student has their goal. But then critique is all around this discussion of how are you achieving that goal and can you make that better, the formal translation. So it was very much just back and forth. And that, I think that's what we love about the studio environment and that format is the type of discussion and this reliance on your collaborators helping you achieve your goal.
Yeah, and I want to echo that, and also say that you know, working with Jenny was just amazing. I mean, each student, obviously, we're trying to make them break out of their mindset of the way things exactly need to be, and just say, okay, think larger, think bigger. So you know, when we're talking about this last group, the whole idea of think of what it means to find those spots where you find Instagrammable moments. And Jenny had just a large repository. Like, think of this artist, think of this other artist, think of the ice cream museum in LA, or the lamp exhibit that's part of the LACMA museum here in Los Angeles. So having a wealth of information to give the student to kind of help him motivate him and help him really think outside the box was great. And then I would go in and say, okay, now think about the technology. How's the technology going to help you, and who's the user, and what exactly is they're going to try to accomplish? So it kind of bouncing them back between just motivate him and maybe forward, and also be realistic and try to accomplish the goal. I think that's again, like I said, that's part of the studio environment and the iterative environment.
Yeah. Really amazing collaboration, and I think the two of us really helped balance it out for the students, and to really always be encouraging them not to just the conceptual rigor, but then always about, okay, now get into Second Life. And I think that's such an important part of the studio, was that, you know, they ended up at the results they did that we shared because they were building every single week some sort of refinement on site. So I think that really forced them to further develop it and to kind of step back from their own work and really deal with the sometimes to them they felt like, oh, you know, the restrictions of reality. But from the class, I think they really worked and found ways to be creative within those seemingly like limitations, but actually in the end they discovered it's not. So I think that was another key component.
So the last question about avatar creation. So amazingly, our students were well versed in many tools. So you know, they use a lot of you know, they use Discord, they use Slack, they use Zoom, and they would use also, you know, Second Life every now and then. But you know, as any of us know, that if you're running SolidWorks and you're running, you know, After Effects, having Second Life also consuming graphics at the same time might be a little bit of a competition. So the way they actually got them to work for some of this work, you know, was really kind of managing whatever tools they were working on. So I'm not sure they actually spent as much in Second Life as they did outside designing and thinking about the procedure. So from that point of view, I don't think they actually spend too much time worrying about their avatars. So yes, I think for students afterwards coming in, I think the avatar and the connected connection to the avatar, that would be very meaningful. Absolutely. I think we're running out of time, so thank you so very much, everybody. Feel free to contact us. You have our email addresses and you have the links. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.